Trust on the CDR market is improving slowly in line with the rest of the voluntary carbon market. But in removals, there's 102 methodologies, there's 30 standards. It's really confusing to navigate. And the ICVCM and their core carbon principles verification, they are getting there, but there's a huge amount of standards to get through and not all standards have applied. And the EU CRCF, really, that's where everyone's looking, these government endorsed frameworks, but it just takes time and we need companies and governments to participate now versus wait for some point in the future.
Carbonsations, today's carbon industry leaders.
Welcome to the Carbonsations podcast, where we speak to some of the leading figures in the emerging carbon industry. Today, we're joined by Megan Kemp, head of carbon dioxide removal at South Pole, working exclusively with the advanced buyer facility NextGen CDR. South Pole is a Swiss carbon finance consultancy founded in 2006, and NextGen CDR is a partnership between South Pole and Mitsubishi Corporation and is also the world's largest diversified portfolio for permanent carbon removals, aimed at scaling the CDR market. Megan, it's an honor to have you on the show, and I can't wait to get into the details of your work with NextGen. But before that, you may know that on this podcast, we're really keen on getting our guest's backstory first. So if you don't mind, it would be great if you could share with us a little of what you used to do before joining South Pole.
Hi, Violet. It's so good to be here. Thank you so much for having me on. Absolutely. So I've been at South Pole for about a year now. And as you mentioned, I lead NextGen and think about everything to do with market building and engagement on that side. And then on the South Pole side, I'm really working on designing and building our CDR strategy, how we drive this market forward, where it makes sense to play in line with what is actually needed versus what we can imagine we'd like to have for our climate goals. My whole career really prior to South Pole has been based on big unanswerable questions and collaboration between the sectors. So I was driving our no deal strategy at the Department for External the European Union. I worked in the Prime Minister's COVID unit looking at international cooperation and data. I was part of setting up McKinsey's carbon management sector. And really that all came together when I was looking at policy and markets at Harvard for my MBA.
Brilliant. Thank you. Now, moving further on in time, how did you end up working for South Pole and what's that been like for you?
That's a great question. I came to South Pole really as part of that journey on big unanswerable questions. I think that the main unanswerable question for our generation is how do we ameliorate and reverse the effects of climate change? So I really was drawn to what South Pole, and really specifically NextGen, is doing on carbon removals and the opportunity to grow an organization that has been around for 18 years, really was one of the foundational players of the voluntary carbon market, help it move into these new spaces, move into real management of risk, real carbon dioxide removal versus, or as well as, avoidance and reduction, where they have been really focused over the last 18 years. So NextGen is a global advanced buyers facility. And as you mentioned at the start, it's a combination between South Pole and Mitsubishi Corporation with our big five founding buyers, Boston Consulting Group, LGT, Mitsui OSK Lines, Swiss Re and UBS. And we really are specializing in high quality carbon dioxide removals at an accessible price of $200 a ton, which especially in 2022 was not seen on the market. And even today, despite a lot of projections around price and where it was going to go, is not really possible. So we kind of have two explicit targets. Number one, providing this de-risked portfolio of durable CDRs to corporate buyers, and then building a trustworthy, scalable CDR market through our policy advocacy, through advisory, and through that market expertise. We were set up as a real test for South Pole and Mitsubishi to look into the CDR market, to determine how it worked, how to engage with it, where we can be most useful. And we're using it as central to a wider piece at South Pole on bespoke long-term portfolios, buyers clubs, spot purchases, looking at NBS, looking at tech CDR, really growing what was initially a small experiment.
All right. So with all that said, you, like very few others, are in the position to comment on the state of the carbon removal market to date. So what would you say are the market's main challenges right now?
So I speak to buyers, suppliers, ecosystem members, policymakers from across the carbon removal market basically every day. And you're totally right. I think that gives me a bit of a picture of what the market looks like, uniquely what its challenges are, and hopefully a little bit of hope on where it's going. So I think it's worth saying that the carbon removal market today is nascent. It's got unstable supply and demand dynamics. Using the absolutely fabulous tool of CDR FYI, we can see that only 12 megatons of carbon removals have been purchased, of which like 3-4% have been delivered, and 80% of the market is Microsoft, which does not a formal, properly active market make. But it's broadly accepted that the potential of the market is significant. So we know that CDR is vital for net zero. We know durable credits will displace avoidance credits and should, according to the Oxford offsetting principles. And we know that regulation will drive demand. So this will become a $1 trillion market. And more importantly, it will, fingers crossed, meet climate needs. So the challenge is not really like where we're going. It's how to move from today to the future and move there as fast as possible so we don't negate the opportunity to actually reach our targets. So I think about it with three main challenges. Number one, what is the forcing mechanism for corporates to purchase CDR? Right now, it's not in compliance markets. We know it's coming. The European ETS have said around 2031, either it will be included there or a removals trading system. We've got the UK ETS, but that's not coming till 2028. Japan has included CDR in its GX League, which becomes a more compliant style from 2026. And similar, but not the same, you've got Corsia Phase 2 kicking in 2027. It's all coming, but it's not enough to move corporate and drive corporate action yet. And the same on the voluntary side with the corporate claiming. We've had a lot about SBTi over the last years, and they are really trying to respond by creating their second version of the corporate net zero standard. We're hoping that includes net negative emissions targets and delivery over the years, as opposed to just in the net zero year, but we're waiting to see on that. And then ISO are developing their own corporate framework for release in 2026. Again, coming, but not enough to drive demand yet. And then the second big challenge is the price is just way too high. Tech CDR average price is around, $400 a ton. MBS is about $50. It's about 5 to 10 for avoidance, or frankly, it's 0 for doing nothing, which is what most companies are choosing to do. Kind of fairly so, because there's been a lot of negative press around greenwashing. If you put your head above the parapet, it's worse than just hiding. And there are other stresses over the years on organizations, especially in the last couple of years, that have really led to a decrease in their sustainability budgets. I think there's been some interesting things that companies are doing around internal carbon pricing and raising that over time. Look at Swiss Re, check out the really interesting papers from the FMC and the WBCSD on this. But we haven't quite got that solved yet, how to meet where the optimum price is and how to get there. And then lastly, there's trust. So trust on the CDR market is improving slowly in line with the rest of the voluntary carbon market. But in removals, there's 102 methodologies, there's 30 standards. It's really confusing to navigate. And the ICVCM and their core carbon principles verification, they are getting there, but there's a huge amount of standards to get through and not all standards have applied. And the EU CRCF, really, that's where everyone's looking, these government endorsed frameworks, but it just takes time and we need companies and governments to participate now versus wait for some point in the future. And there are a couple of other challenges on high integrity supply at scale. That's huge. And then juvenile infrastructure. But my mind is always really attuned to that demand piece first.
Yeah, that does seem to be the kind of the most pressing question that's on everybody's minds at the moment. But another thing I wanted to ask you about is also your approach to assessing carbon removal projects before including them in the portfolio. Can you walk us through that process?
Yeah, absolutely. NextGen is uniquely placed because we've got 7 organizations that have to approve. We've got Mitsubishi Corporation, we've got South Pole, and then we have our 5 buyers who have veto rights on what projects are included in the portfolio. But we think really about 2 things. We think about the individual projects and assessing them, and then we think about how they fit in with the portfolio composition. So on individual projects, you've got the technical due diligence, which is led by Mitsubishi and South Pole, who have decades of experience on the technical side, on the infrastructure side. And I think that's such a strength that we have, and we're very lucky to be in this position. Then you've got commercial due diligence, which in this sort of case is really focused around delivery and delivery risk. These are organizations that are often small. They often have founders who aren't super experienced in setting up these giant 20-year infrastructure projects. And so do we truly believe that it will deliver, not just for us, but in the future? And then we really think about co-benefits, how this is going to impact the community that the project is in, create jobs, how they're factoring that in and how they can guarantee it. And then from the portfolio side, we have huge restrictions on what can actually go in the portfolio and the weighting. And that includes geography, that includes technology, all under this umbrella of an average price of $200 a ton. So we might take a project through due diligence and it passes everything. But when we model it into the portfolio, it doesn't actually work. And in that case, we either pass it on to South Pole and Mitsubishi for their own purposes of CDR portfolios, or we think about how to include it in future portfolios for an ongoing NextGen or for South Pole.
Excellent. And what types of projects can apply? Like, are all technologies welcome, or and what stage of development do you expect them to be in?
So at the moment, we think about 3 individual things with projects. We think about the standard, we think about the technology, and we think about delivery. So on standards, a project can only apply if it is verified under an ICRO endorsed standard. So Puro, Vera, Isometric, Gold Standard, we're all familiar with these now. And on technology, we actually only accept 5 of the most progressed technology types. So BECCS, biochar, direct air capture, enhanced rock weathering, and product mineralization. But we're always up for reassessing this. And for example, we're talking to Jill Story at the Ocean Council, looking at how we can include marine in future portfolios, and always really trying to ensure that we are supporting the technology most likely to scale and are technology agnostic as much as possible, because there truly is no one answer. Each of them has huge pitfalls and huge advantages right now. And so we're not backing one technology or another. And then on delivery, we only accept projects that can deliver from 2025 to 2030, which removes a huge swathe of projects to date who aren't actually at scale and aren't actually able to deliver past their pilot project. These projects also need a lot of support, and we're really lucky that some of the other organizations on the market are focusing in on this innovation funding, but we are focusing our support where we can create bankable projects and build the market at scale now.
Since you mentioned deliverability, the topic of insurance came to my mind. Do you work with third-party insurance, or do you offer your own insurance? How does that fit into the picture at all?
So right now on NextGen, we aren't working with insurance companies just because it's a future portfolio. So part of the active portfolio management is swapping in and out projects based on delivery. So we don't need the insurance in the same way that a more traditional portfolio or a portfolio that was delivering from today would. I think we're really, really excited by some of the insurance products that are coming on the market. And we've been having lots of conversations with Howden, with Kita, on how we think about that for future credit wrapping, future portfolio wrapping. But for NextGen, we don't need that. We don't need the buffer.
Understood. Megan, thanks so much for sharing what NextGen is all about. It's certainly a very exciting initiative, and I'm thrilled that our listeners get to hear about it from the source. But another thing I've really been keen on asking you about is the CDR Request for Proposals 2024. What is it, and how does it tie into you reaching that $200 per ton price point?
So our RFP, we released it in April, and it was designed to do a couple of things. One, like complete the technology mix. So up until April, we purchased across all of our technologies apart from ELW, and then also complete our portfolio. We are purchasing until the end of 2025. And so needed an opportunity to look at the whole market, pull in from suppliers that we probably hadn't spoken to, especially those outside of the EU and the US. And it was kind of crazy. We got hundreds of responses from across the world, of which maybe unsurprisingly, about 70% were biochar, which really reflects the market today. It really reflects the delivery parameters, who can actually deliver biochar companies. And then how did it contribute to that $200 a ton? Well, $200 is an average price we're targeting across the portfolio. So we've purchased above and below to date, but we just have to stay within that boundary. 200 is about the social cost of carbon. It's about what our buyers are willing to pay. And so when we are looking at organizations that have put forward for the RFP, we look at those prices within our whole portfolio. So it doesn't mean that we wouldn't buy a carbon removal at $400 a ton. It doesn't mean that we wouldn't buy carbon removal at $100 a ton. It just means that we're mapping them against each other. But certainly we saw when that RFP came out and people responded that those really high price CDRs, one, they hadn't applied and it wasn't included, which I think probably makes sense because of the weight of our portfolio.
Excellent. Now, I recently saw that NextGen tapped into the Asian market through a deal with Alt Carbon. Can you tell us about that deal?
Absolutely. Oh, we are so hyped about this deal. So we're working with Shrey, Sparsh, and the whole Alt Carbon team. And for those listeners who don't know what Alt Carbon is, they spread locally sourced basalt across tea plantations in Darjeeling, and it speeds up the rock's ability to remove carbon dioxide removal and store that for 10,000 years plus. And they passed our DD. We were really excited about the project. It fit within our portfolio parameters. And they just have such an interesting story. They're treating ELW as part of their Darjeeling revival project, which includes like really rejuvenating the tea industry, focusing their labs in India, in Darjeeling, to bring scientific jobs right there, and building this all with community support. And they're really targeting a huge expanse, 5 megatons by 2030. Let's really hope they get there. And we just wanted to play a small part in that journey. I think it's also worth saying that they are our first purchase outside of the US and EU, and they mark the beginning of this new set of purchases from the Global South. I think it's core to NextGen that CDR is international. Carbon dioxide knows no land borders, and neither should its removal. And so we want to really practice what we've been preaching.
Excellent. And on that note, before we wrap up, I'd also like to get your take on the CDR market at large. Where do you see the space heading in the years ahead?
I think we're probably both agreed that we need the carbon removal market to be ginormous, gigaton scale, 10 gigatons by 2050, let's say 400 megatons by 2030, basically to ensure that our children and grandchildren aren't underwater. And I truly believe that we will get there. I was at a talk with Vanessa Chan from the Department of Energy the other day, and she said that this sector is private sector led, government enabled. And I really believe that. I think governments will step in, as they have done before, for products that are a public good and that cross policy lines. So this really crosses trade, energy, infrastructure, etc. renewable energy is a really obvious example here. I think it will be a highly regulated market with traditional market infrastructure. Let's get the auditors in there. Let's get insurance in there, as you mentioned. Let's get the traditional rating agencies in there. Let's have a really transparent collection of data, the Bloomberg equivalent of the CDR market. And I think it will look long-term like a commodities market, which is disputed. And I think I've had arguments on this at every single conference I've been to in the last year. But I want that 1 ton of CO2 to equal 1 ton of CO2, differentiated only by storage duration versus it acting more like an equities market. And I think we're in this unique moment where we can build all of this from a more just foundation. So actually including the global south rather than excluding them, which FYI will be way more economically viable. Really driving international trade and cooperation, initially facilitated by Article 6.4, fingers crossed for COP, and funding really coming from the West, coming from emitters. It's not that often that you get the opportunity to be at the foundational creating of a market. And so we shouldn't forget that we do have the mechanisms to change and create something just.
So obviously this is a little bit of a crystal ball gazing type of question on my end, but when do you see this kind of happening? Like as far as like convergence of like compliance and voluntary markets goes?
Oh,
yeah.
I would love to know that. So I think, let's be honest, every projection of the CDR market for the last 5 years has over-predicted where we're going to be today. I went back and looked at all of the projections that you can think of, and everyone said that we would have been on about 100 megatons today, which we're clearly not. So I don't want to over-predict. I think by 2030, we'll still be very voluntary market reliant. I'm going to say about 10% of transactions will be on the compliance market. So commodities are a long way off, or the commodities market is a long way off, let's say 2050. But that convergence, I think we'll really see that through 2035. And it's only possible, and we can only possibly really have an active compliance market if we are building the foundations for that today. It can't just be switched on. These infrastructure projects are 20-year long, need large project level financing. And so we have to work out a way to prep for that market, or that eventual idealistic view will just keep being further and further off.
And how reliant would you say the market is going to be on the decision of the upcoming COP29 regarding Article 6, whether there will be a decision or not?
Yeah, I mean, I am hopeful, but hopefully not naive about what's going to happen at the next COP. I think really the market has to progress irrespective on a voluntary basis with what we've been doing so far. So corporates purchasing on behalf of their net zero, not super attached to NDCs at the current time. Obviously, we're really hopeful that the changes or the recommendations on removals guidance that have been improved by the supervisory body of Article 6.4 are held so that we can really progress. But I'm kind of focusing on COP30, on driving the market irrespective of what the outcome is.
It is nice to be ending the episode on a hopeful note. But I do have one final question for you, Megan. And please do let us know what NextGen has coming up. Any announcements or future developments that you can hint at would be greatly appreciated.
Oh, absolutely. So we'll be co-hosting an event at the IATA Business Hub at COP29 on November the 15th at 2:30. If any of your listeners want to attend, please DM me on LinkedIn. It's focused on unlocking net zero and the role of carbon dioxide removals. So any organization that's thinking about how to engage in CDR, anyone that's confused, any policymakers, come along. Got a really great panel there. We'll also be announcing more purchases from our RFP soon as we start to complete this first portfolio for NextGen. And then look out for more news from South Pole on our newest steps in CDR, how we're showing that we actually believe in carbon removals, how we are much more hopeful than maybe this podcast just ended on, and are really investing in the future of the voluntary and compliance markets.
Excellent. Megan, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It was lovely to chat with you and learn more about South Pole's work and particularly about NextGen CDR. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks so much.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Carbonsations podcast and would like to hear more conversations like this, please be sure to subscribe. We really appreciate the support.